David's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 in the morning, but he was already awake. He'd been staring at the ceiling for the past hour, his mind racing with thoughts about the day ahead. Today wasn't just another day. Today could change everything, for his family. He quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his wife Lisa, who was finally getting some peaceful sleep after weeks of worry. The bills stacked on their kitchen table seemed to grow taller each day, and the rejection letters from job applications had become a familiar sight in their mailbox. But today was different. Today, he had a real chance. The shower water was lukewarm, at best, but David barely noticed. His thoughts were focused on the interview waiting for him in Denver. After 6 months of unemployment, this operations manager position at Rocky Mountain Airlines felt like a lifeline. He had practiced his answers 100 times, researched the company until he could recite their mission statement backwards, and even bought a new tie with money they couldn't really afford to spend. As he shaved, David caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The stress lines around his eyes had deepened over the past months, and there were more gray hairs than he remembered. 42 years old, and sometimes he felt like he was starting over from scratch. The airline industry had been his life for 15 years until the layoffs came. Budget cuts, they called it. Nothing personal, just business. Lisa stirred as he was putting on his shirt. "Good luck today, honey," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep and hope. "I know you're going to do great." He kissed her forehead gently. "I'll call you as soon as it's over," he promised. Their 8-year-old son Tommy was still fast asleep in the next room, clutching his favorite airplane toy. David had bought it for him during better times, when flying to different cities for work was just part of the routine. Now, even this, one flight to Denver had required careful budgeting. The drive to the airport felt longer than usual, even though traffic was light at this early hour. David's mind kept wandering to what-if scenarios. What if he said the wrong thing? What if they had already decided on someone else? What if this was just another dead end? He shook his head, trying to push away the negative thoughts. Lisa always told him he was his own worst enemy sometimes, and she was probably right. He had the experience, the knowledge, and the passion for the job. That had to count for something. Chicago O'Hare was already bustling with activity when David arrived. The familiar sounds and smells of the airport brought back memories of his working days, when he practically lived in terminals like this one. He used to complain about all the travel, but now he missed the energy, the constant movement, the feeling of being part of something bigger. Check-in went smoothly, and David felt a small surge of confidence as he headed toward security. His flight wasn't until 9:15 a.m., and it was only 7:45. Plenty of time, he thought. That's when he saw the line. The security checkpoint stretched back further than he had ever seen it. Travelers stood with their luggage looking frustrated and checking their phones constantly. A sign near the front explained that 2 of the scanning machines were down for maintenance, causing delays of up to 45 minutes. David's stomach dropped. He pulled out his phone and checked his boarding pass again. Gate C14. His interview was scheduled for 1:30 p.m. Mountain Time, which gave him some buffer room, but not much. Missing this flight would mean missing the interview, and there wasn't another flight that would get him there in time. He joined the line, trying to stay calm. Around him, other passengers were having similar realizations. A businessman in an expensive suit was on his phone, rescheduling meetings. A young woman with a backpack kept checking her watch and muttering about missing her connecting flight. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the kind of stress that comes from having important plans thrown into uncertainty. The line moved at a snail's pace. Every few minutes, David would check his watch and calculate the time remaining. 8:10 a.m. Still okay. 8:25 a.m., getting tight but manageable. 8:40 a.m. This was cutting it very close. That's when he noticed her. The elderly woman was about 3 people ahead of him in line, and she was clearly struggling. She appeared to be in her 70s, dressed in an elegant navy blue suit that spoke of quality and taste. But her hands were shaking as she tried to manage her belongings. Her purse kept slipping from her shoulder, and she seemed confused by the security procedures. Other passengers around her were growing impatient. David could hear mumbled complaints and see people checking their phones with increasing frustration. The woman was moving slowly, stopping frequently to catch her breath, and it was obvious that the pressure from the crowd was making her more flustered. "Come on, lady," someone behind David muttered. "Some of us have places to be." David felt a flash of irritation, not at the elderly woman but at the person complaining. He had been in customer service long enough to know that patience and kindness went a lot further than impatience and rudeness. But he also understood the frustration. Everyone in this line had somewhere important to be. As they moved closer to the security checkpoint, David watched the woman more carefully. She was alone, which seemed unusual for someone her age traveling through such a busy airport. Her luggage was expensive, but clearly heavy for her to manage. Most telling of all, she kept looking around with the expression of someone who was lost or overwhelmed. The security agents were clearly getting impatient too. David could see them glancing at the woman and then at the long line behind her. Airport. Security had its own pressures and schedules to maintain. They needed to keep people moving, especially with the equipment problems they were already dealing with. When the woman finally reached the security checkpoint, things went from bad to worse. She seemed confused about the process of removing her shoes and placing items in bins. Her purse spilled open as she tried to lift it into a container, sending personal items scattering across the conveyor belt. Pills from a prescription bottle rolled in different directions, and she looked mortified as she tried to collect them. David checked his watch again. 8:52 a.m. His boarding would begin in 23 minutes, and he was still at least 15 minutes away from even getting through security. The knot in his stomach tightened. This interview meant everything to his family. The position paid well enough to catch up on their mortgage payments and maybe even take Lisa out for a nice dinner for the first time in months. But as he watched the elderly woman struggle, clearly embarrassed and overwhelmed, David felt something else entirely. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same expression he had seen in the mirror during his own worst moments over the past 6 months. The look of someone who felt lost and vulnerable, trying to maintain dignity while everything seemed to be falling apart around them. The woman was now holding up the entire security line, and the complaints from other passengers were getting louder. David saw a tear roll down her cheek as she tried unsuccessfully to gather her scattered belongings. The security agent was tapping his foot, clearly wanting to move things along. In that moment, David faced a choice that would change everything. He could stay in line, focus on his own problems, and hope someone else would help. After all, he had his own family to think about, his own future hanging in the balance. Or he could step forward and do what he knew was right, regardless of the cost. The boarding announcement for his flight echoed through the terminal just as the elderly woman dropped her purse again, spilling its contents across the floor for the second time. David stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The boarding announcement for his flight was still echoing through the terminal when he made his decision. Without thinking about the consequences, he stepped out of line and walked toward the elderly woman who was kneeling on the floor, desperately trying to collect her scattered belongings. "Here, let me help you with that," David said gently, crouching down beside her. His voice was calm and reassuring, the same tone he used to use when training new employees who were overwhelmed on their first day. The woman looked up at him with surprised, watery eyes. "Oh, you don't have to do that, dear. I'm just being clumsy. I'm holding everyone up." "Don't worry about that," David replied, carefully picking up her prescription bottles and reading the labels to make sure he was putting the right pills in the right containers. "We all have days like this. What's your name?" "Eleanor," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "Eleanor Whitman, and you're very kind to help an old woman who can't seem to manage simple things anymore." David smiled warmly as he helped her to her feet. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitman. I'm David, and trust me, airport security isn't simple for anyone. I've been flying for years, and it still makes me nervous sometimes." Behind them, David could hear the growing impatience of the other passengers. Someone muttered something about missing their connection, and another person was loudly complaining to their phone about delays. David felt the weight of their frustration, but he also noticed that Mrs. Whitman's hands had stopped shaking now that someone was helping her. "Now let's get you through this step by step," David said, guiding her, toward the security bins. First, we'll put your purse in this container. Don't worry about emptying it completely, just take out any electronics or large metal items. Mrs. Whitman fumbled with the clasps on her elegant leather handbag. David noticed her jewelry, a simple but expensive-looking pearl necklace and matching earrings. Her clothes were clearly high quality, too, the kind that spoke of success and refinement. But right now, she just looked like a frightened elderly woman trying to navigate a system that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate. I used to travel all the time for business, Mrs. Whitman said as David helped her remove her iPad from her purse. But that was years ago, and everything is so different now, so much more complicated. What kind of business were you in? David asked, making conversation to keep her calm while he helped organize her belongings into the security bins. Oh, various things, she replied vaguely. I've been retired for a while now, but I still have some interests that require travel. Not as often as I'd like, though. My children think I should stay home and let them handle everything. David nodded understandingly. He had seen this dynamic before. Successful people who suddenly felt lost when age or circumstances changed their routine. Well, you're doing great, see? We've got everything organized now. The security agent who had been growing impatient earlier seemed to soften when he saw David helping. Take your time, ma'am, he said to Mrs. Whitman. Just remove your shoes when you're ready. This proved to be the next challenge. Mrs. Whitman's shoes were elegant but complicated, with small buckles that her arthritic fingers couldn't manage easily. David knelt down without being asked and carefully helped her with the straps, making sure she had something to hold on to for balance. You're going to miss your flight, Mrs. Whitman said, worry creeping into her voice. I heard them calling for boarding. You shouldn't be helping me when you have somewhere important to be. David glanced up at the departure board. His gate was flashing, final boarding call. His heart sank, but he managed to keep his voice steady. Don't worry about that. Right now, the most important thing is making sure you get through security safely. But Mrs. Whitman was more perceptive than he had given her credit for. That flight is important to you, isn't it? You have that look that people get when they're worried about something big. David helped her through the metal detector before answering. I have a job interview in Denver, he admitted. It's pretty important. My family has been going through a tough time lately. What kind of work do you do? Mrs. Whitman asked as they waited for her belongings to come through the X-ray machine. I used to manage airline operations, David said, watching the clock, and calculating that his flight was probably taxiing away from the gate by now. Ground operations, customer service, that sort of thing. I was laid off 6 months ago, and this interview today was really my best shot at getting back on my feet. Mrs. Whitman studied his face carefully. You said was. You're talking like it's already over. David tried to smile, but he knew it didn't reach his eyes. Well, I'm pretty sure I just missed my flight, and there's not another one that would get me there in time for the interview. The X-ray machine beeped, and the operator called Mrs. Whitman over. One of her bags needed additional screening. David could see her start to panic again, so he stayed close, explaining what was happening and reassuring her that this was routine. Why did you help me? Mrs. Whitman asked quietly while they waited. You knew you might miss your flight. You knew how important it was, so why did you stop? David thought about the question. He could have given her a simple answer about being raised to help others, or about basic human decency, but something about Mrs. Whitman's direct gaze made him want to be completely honest. Because I've been where you are, he said finally. Not exactly the same situation, but I know what it feels like to be overwhelmed and alone, trying to handle something that used to be easy but suddenly isn't anymore. These past 6 months I've felt lost more times than I can count. If someone had helped me during one of those moments, it would have meant everything. Mrs. Whitman's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of gratitude rather than frustration. You have a family? A wife and a son, David said, helping her put her shoes back on now that the additional screening was complete. Lisa works part-time at a local school, but it's not enough to cover everything. Tommy is 8 and he still believes his dad can fix anything. I was hoping this job would let me be that person again. What would you have told the company? About missing the interview? David shrugged. The truth, I suppose. That I helped someone who needed help and I missed my flight because of it. They probably wouldn't have believed me, or they would have thought I was irresponsible for not managing my time better. Mrs. Whitman was quiet for a moment as she gathered her belongings. Everything was back in order now, and she looked much more composed than she had 20 minutes earlier. But David noticed she was studying him with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone he had just met. David, she said slowly, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll consider it carefully. Of course, I'm traveling to Denver too. My flight doesn't leave for another hour, and I have to admit I'm still feeling a bit anxious about traveling alone. Would you consider changing your ticket and flying with me? I know it sounds presumptuous, but I would feel much safer having someone kind nearby. David blinked in surprise. That's very generous, Mrs. Whitman, but I couldn't ask you to pay for a new ticket. And honestly, even if I got to Denver later today, the interview slot would be filled by someone else. Mrs. Whitman smiled mysteriously. Let me worry about the ticket. And as for the interview, well, sometimes when one door closes, another one opens. Will you trust me on this? David looked at this elegant elderly woman who had somehow gone from seeming helpless to appearing remarkably self-assured in the span of a few minutes. There was something about her demeanor that had shifted, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. His practical mind told him this was crazy. He should try to catch the next available flight on his own dime, call the company to explain, and hope for the best. But something deeper told him that Mrs. Whitman was offering more than just companionship on a flight. Okay, he said finally, if you're sure it's not too much trouble. Mrs. Whitman's smile was radiant. Oh, David, I have a feeling this is going to work out better than you could possibly imagine. Within 30 minutes, David found himself holding a first-class boarding pass that Mrs. Whitman had somehow arranged with what seemed like a simple phone call. He stared at the ticket in disbelief, noting that his name was printed correctly, and everything appeared legitimate. How did you manage this so quickly? He asked as they walked toward the gate together. Mrs. Whitman moved with much more confidence now, her earlier frailty seemingly replaced by a quiet determination. I've been flying for many years, she said with a slight smile. You learn to make connections with people who can help when you need it. The airline industry is smaller than most people think. They found seats near the gate, and David couldn't help but notice how other passengers seemed to recognize Mrs. Whitman. A flight attendant walking by nodded respectfully to her, and the gate agent had been unusually accommodating when she approached the counter earlier. David assumed she must be a frequent flyer with high status. Tell me more about your family, Mrs. Whitman said, settling into her seat with her purse carefully placed beside her. You mentioned your wife works at a school? David's face lit up when talking about Lisa. She's a reading specialist at the OA elementary school in our neighborhood. She loves working with kids who struggle with learning difficulties. The pay isn't great, but she says the reward is worth more than money. He paused, then added honestly, though we could definitely use more money right now. And your son Tommy? He's 8 and obsessed with airplanes, David laughed. Ironic considering his dad used to work in aviation and is now unemployed. He builds model planes, draws pictures of jets, and can tell you the difference between a Boeing 737 and an Airbus A320 just by looking at them. Mrs. Whitman seemed genuinely interested. Does he want to be a pilot when he grows up? Sometimes. Other days he wants to be an astronaut or an airline captain or someone who designs planes. Really, he just loves anything that flies. David's expression grew more serious. I used to take him to the airport sometimes, just to watch the planes, take off and land. We haven't done that in a while. It's hard to explain to an 8-year-old why Daddy doesn't work at the airport anymore. What exactly did you do in airline operations? Mrs. Whitman asked, and David noticed she was paying very careful attention to his answer. I managed ground operations for a regional carrier based out of Chicago, David explained. Everything from coordinating baggage handling to managing gate assignments, dealing with weather delays, and overseeing customer service. But the part I loved most was solving problems, especially when it involved helping passengers. Can you give me an example? David thought for a moment. Well, There was this one time during a massive snowstorm. We had hundreds of passengers stranded overnight, and the airport was running out of hotel rooms. Instead of just telling people they were stuck, I worked with local businesses to arrange temporary sleeping areas in airport lounges, coordinated with restaurants to provide free meals and set up charging stations so people could stay in touch with their families. We even arranged for a local pharmacy to deliver medications for passengers who needed them. Mrs. Whitman nodded approvingly. That sounds like you went well beyond what was required. Maybe, but that's what good customer service means to me. People trust us with their travel plans, their family visits, their business trips. When things go wrong, we have a responsibility to take care of them, not just process them. David ran his hand through his hair. I guess that philosophy wasn't cost-effective enough for the new management. What happened when you were laid off? David's voice grew quieter. They called it restructuring. Said they were eliminating middle management positions and streamlining operations. 23 people lost their jobs that day, including some who had been with the company for over a decade. They gave us a severance package and wished us luck. That must have been devastating. The hardest part was going home and telling Lisa. She just held me while I cried, and then she said we'd figure it out together. But I could see the worry in her eyes. Our mortgage, Tommy's school expenses, everything we had planned. It all felt impossible suddenly. Mrs. Whitman was quiet for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. What would you do differently if you ran an airline? The question surprised David. That's a big question. Are you thinking of starting an airline? He joked. Mrs. Whitman smiled, mysteriously. Humor me. If you could design the perfect airline from scratch, what would it look like? David found himself getting excited talking about this hypothetical scenario. First, I'd focus on reliability. People need to know that when they book a flight, we'll do everything possible to get them where they need to go on time. But when things do go wrong, and they will, we'd have real solutions, not just apologies. What kind of solutions? Proactive rebooking before passengers even know there's a problem. Partnerships with ground transportation companies for alternative travel options. Real meal vouchers that work at decent restaurants, not just fast food. Most importantly, empowered employees who can make decisions to help customers without having to call 5 different supervisors. Mrs. Whitman leaned forward, clearly engaged. What about the business side? Airlines have to make money to survive. Absolutely. But I think treating customers well actually saves money in the long run. Happy customers become repeat customers. They recommend you to their friends. They don't file complaints that require expensive resolution processes. And employees who feel empowered to help people are more satisfied with their jobs, which reduces turnover costs. You sound like you've given this a lot of thought, David laughed. I've had 6 months of unemployment to think about it. Lisa jokes that I should write a book called How to Run an Airline by Someone Who Got Fired from One. That's not a bad idea, actually, Mrs. Whitman said seriously. Have you considered consulting, helping existing airlines improve their operations? I've thought about it, but who's going to hire a consultant who couldn't keep his own job? David shook his head. Besides, I need steady income right now, not the uncertainty of freelance work. Mrs. Whitman pulled out her phone and glanced at it. David, I need to make a quick call before we board. It's about some business matters I need to arrange in Denver. Would you excuse me for a few minutes? Of course. David watched as Mrs. Whitman walked a short distance away and began speaking quietly into her phone. He couldn't hear the conversation, but her body language had changed again. She stood straighter, spoke with obvious authority, and seemed to be giving detailed instructions to whoever was on the other end. While she was gone, David called Lisa to explain what had happened. You missed your flight to help an elderly woman? Lisa's voice was a mixture of pride and worry. Oh, honey, that's exactly the kind of person you are. But what about the interview? I know. But Lisa, you should have seen her. She was so scared and confused, and everyone was getting impatient with her. I couldn't just walk away. I'm proud of you, Lisa said softly. I really am. But what are we going to do now? I don't know yet. This Mrs. Whitman arranged for me to fly with her to Denver, and she seems to think something good might come of it. I can't explain it, but there's something different about her. Something that makes me think she's more than just a regular traveler. Different how? She asks really specific questions about airline operations, like she knows the industry well. And the way staff here treat her, it's like she's someone important. Plus, she got me a first-class ticket with one phone call. Just be careful, David. Sometimes when things seem too good to be true. I know. But what choice do I have right now? Maybe this is just a nice elderly woman being kind to someone who helped her, or maybe it's something more. Either way, I'm already committed. When Mrs. Whitman returned from her call, she seemed even more purposeful than before. Everything arranged? David asked. Yes, quite well, actually, she replied, gathering her belongings as the boarding announcement began. David, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what would you say is your greatest strength as a manager? Honestly, I think it's remembering that every decision affects real people. When I was scheduling staff, I tried to remember that they had families and lives outside of work. When I was dealing with delayed passengers, I tried to remember that they might be missing their daughter's wedding or rushing to see a sick parent. Numbers and efficiency matter, but people matter more. Mrs. Whitman nodded slowly. And your greatest weakness? David laughed. According to my former boss, I cared too much. I spent too much time on individual customer problems instead of focusing on overall metrics. I guess today proved his point. I'm still putting individual people ahead of my own best interests. I don't think that's a weakness at all, Mrs. Whitman said firmly. I think it might be exactly what the right company is looking for. As they stood in line to board the plane, David noticed Mrs. Whitman checking her phone again. She seemed to be reading something that made her smile with satisfaction. Good news, he asked. Very good news, she replied. I think this trip to Denver is going to be much more interesting than either of us expected. The first-class cabin was more luxurious than anything David had experienced in years. As he settled into the wide leather seat next to Mrs. Whitman, he couldn't help but feel out of place. His slightly wrinkled shirt and department store tie seemed shabby compared to the polished elegance around him. I can't thank you enough for this, David said as the flight attendant offered them pre-flight beverages. This seat probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. Mrs. Whitman waved dismissively. Nonsense, it's the least I can do after how kind you were to me. Besides, I hate flying alone these days. Having good company makes the journey much more pleasant. As the plane taxied toward the runway, David noticed something odd. The flight attendant who had served them seemed to know Mrs. Whitman personally, addressing her with a familiarity that went beyond typical customer service. When she offered Mrs. Whitman her drink, she said, Your usual, Mrs. Whitman, Earl Grey with honey? That would be lovely, Jessica. Thank you. David raised an eyebrow. You two know each other? I fly this route fairly regularly, Mrs. Whitman explained, but David sensed there was more to the story. Jessica has been taking care of passengers on this airline for several years now. Haven't you, dear? Jessica smiled warmly. Going on 8 years now, Mrs. Whitman. Best job I've ever had. The company really takes care of its employees. After Jessica moved on to other passengers, David couldn't contain his curiosity. What kind of business takes you to Denver so often? Mrs. Whitman sipped her tea thoughtfully. Oh, various investments and ventures. I'm what you might call a silent partner in several companies. I like to keep an eye on how things are running, make sure the people in charge are making good decisions. That sounds fascinating. What kinds of companies? Service industries mostly. Hospitality, transportation, things that depend on treating customers well. She studied David over her teacup. Tell me, during your time in airline operations, what was the biggest mistake you saw management make? David thought carefully. This woman seemed genuinely interested in his opinions, and her questions were becoming more sophisticated by the hour. I think the biggest mistake was treating employees like expenses instead of assets. When you make people feel replaceable, they stop caring about the quality of their work. When employees stop caring, customers notice immediately. Can you give me a specific example? Sure. My old company decided to cut costs by reducing training time for new customer service representatives from 2 weeks to 3 days. They figured people could learn on the job. Within 6 months, customer complaints increased by 40%. Employees were making mistakes they weren't trained to avoid, and they didn't have the knowledge to solve problems creatively. Mrs. Whitman nodded. What would you have done differently? I would have actually increased training time and focused on empowerment. Teach people not just the procedures, but the reasoning behind them. Give them authority to make decisions that help customers without having to ask permission for every little thing. When employees feel trusted and prepared, they take pride in their work. That sounds expensive. David shook his head. Short term, maybe, but the cost of retraining people who quit, handling complaints, and losing repeat customers is much higher. Plus, when you have confident, knowledgeable employees, they can upsell services naturally because they genuinely believe in what they're offering. Mrs. Whitman was taking notes on a small pad she had pulled from her purse. David found this curious, but didn't want to seem rude by asking about it. What about leadership, she asked. If you were running a company, how would you structure the management team? I'd make sure that anyone in a leadership position had actually done the frontline work. You can't make good decisions about customer service if you've never dealt with an angry passenger at 2 a.m. You can't create efficient processes if you've never had to follow those processes yourself under pressure. That's an interesting philosophy. Most companies promote people based on education or seniority. And that's why so many companies struggle with employee morale and customer satisfaction. The best managers I ever worked with were the ones who remembered what it was like to be in the trenches. They made decisions that actually worked in the real world, not just on paper. Mrs. Whitman glanced at her phone, which had been buzzing periodically throughout their conversation. David, I hope you don't mind, but I need to make another call. Some urgent business that can't wait until we land. Of course, please don't let me stop you. As Mrs. Whitman moved to a more private area of the cabin, David couldn't help but overhear parts of her conversation. Her voice had changed again, becoming more authoritative and businesslike. Yes, I want the entire executive team there for the meeting. No, cancel my 3 o'clock and push everything back. Tell them it's about the new customer experience initiative we discussed. I think I may have found exactly what we're looking for. David tried not to eavesdrop, but the cabin was quiet, and Mrs. Whitman's voice carried more than she probably realized. What struck him most was how different she sounded. Gone was the frail, confused elderly woman from the airport. This was clearly someone used to making important decisions and having them implemented immediately. When she returned to her seat, David decided to address what he had been thinking. Mrs. Whitman, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem very different from when we first met at the airport. She looked at him with raised eyebrows. Different how? Well, at security, you seemed overwhelmed and uncertain. But ever since we started talking about business, you've been asking very specific, very informed questions. And that phone call just now, you sounded like someone who's used to running things. Mrs. Whitman smiled, and for the first time David saw a hint of mischief in her eyes. You're very observant. Tell me, what do you think is going on? David felt like he was being tested, but he decided to be honest. I think you're not just a regular traveler with business interests. I think you're someone with significant influence in the airline industry, and for some reason, you've been interviewing me during this entire flight. And how does that make you feel? Honestly, a little nervous, but also curious. If I'm right, then either I've been making a fool of myself by lecturing you about an industry you probably know better than I do, or somehow this conversation has been going better than I thought. Mrs. Whitman laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. David, you haven't been making a fool of yourself at all. In fact, everything you've said has been exactly what I hoped to hear. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes the best interviews happen when people don't know they're being interviewed. When someone is just being themselves, sharing their genuine thoughts and experiences. David's heart started beating faster. Are you saying this has been a job interview? Not exactly, but it has been an evaluation of sorts. You see, I've been looking for someone to head up a new initiative at one of my companies. Someone with real experience, genuine compassion for both employees and customers, and the kind of integrity that would make them help a stranger even when it might cost them personally. Mrs. Whitman, I don't understand. What kind of company? What kind of initiative? She looked out the window as the plane began its descent toward Denver. All will be revealed soon enough. But David, I want you to know that your kindness at the airport this morning may have changed both of our lives in ways you can't imagine yet. I'm completely confused right now. I know, and I apologize for the mystery, but sometimes opportunities come in unexpected packages. When we land, I'd like you to come with me to one more place before you head home. Can you trust me for just a little longer? David thought about Lisa and Tommy waiting for news about the interview that never happened. He thought about the bills on their kitchen table and the uncertain future ahead of them. But he also thought about this remarkable woman who had somehow turned a disaster into an adventure. Okay, he said finally. I'll trust you. Mrs. Whitman's smile was radiant. Excellent. I think you're going to be very surprised by what happens next. As the plane touched down in Denver, David had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he had never dared to dream. The Blacktown car that picked them up at Denver International Airport was another surprise. David had expected to take a taxi or rideshare, but Mrs. Whitman's driver was waiting with a sign bearing her name. The man, who introduced himself as Robert, treated Mrs. Whitman with the same respectful familiarity that David had noticed from the flight attendant. Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitman, Robert said, taking her luggage. I trust your flight went well. Very well indeed, Robert. This is David, who will be joining us today. Please take us directly to the office. As they drove through downtown Denver, David watched the city pass by through the tinted windows. Mrs. Whitman was making yet another phone call, speaking in clipped professional tones about rearranging meetings and preparing conference rooms. David was beginning to realize that, whoever this woman was, she wielded considerable influence. We should be there in about 15 minutes, she said, ending her call. David, I know this has been a very unusual day for you. How are you feeling? Honestly, like I'm in some kind of dream, David replied. This morning I was just trying to catch a flight for a job interview, and now I'm riding through Denver in a luxury car with a woman who's clearly much more than she first appeared to be. Mrs. Whitman chuckled. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Tell me, are you nervous about meeting new people? Because there will be several people waiting for us. Should I be nervous? Not at all. Just be yourself. That's all you've been doing today, and it's served you very well so far. The car pulled up in front of a gleaming office building with Skyline Airlines prominently displayed across the front. David's heart skipped a beat. He knew this company by reputation. They were a regional carrier known for exceptional customer service and employee satisfaction. Industry magazines regularly featured them as one of the best places to work in aviation. Skyline Airlines? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Mrs. Whitman said simply. My office is on the top floor. David felt the pieces finally clicking into place. Your office? David, I think it's time for a proper introduction. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and I'm the founder and CEO of Skyline Airlines. I started this company 32 years ago with the belief that treating people well, both employees and customers, isn't just the right thing to do, it's also good business. David stared at her in complete shock. You're the Eleanor Whitman? I've read about you in industry publications. You're legendary in aviation circles. Eleanor smiled warmly. I'm just someone who believes in doing business the right way. And today, you showed me exactly the kind of person I've been looking for. As they entered the building, David noticed how every employee they passed greeted Mrs. Whitman with genuine warmth and respect. These weren't the forced pleasantries he had seen at other companies, but real affection and admiration. The security guard asked about her recent trip. A maintenance worker thanked her for the new safety equipment they had requested. A young woman from what appeared to be the marketing department mentioned how much her team appreciated the creative freedom they had been given on a recent project. You really know everyone, David observed as they waited for the elevator. I make it a point to know the people who make this company work, Eleanor replied. From the baggage handlers to the executive team, every person here contributes to our success. How can I make good decisions about their work if I don't understand what they do and who they are? The elevator opened directly into a spacious executive, suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Denver skyline. But what struck David most wasn't the impressive view or elegant furnishings. It was the wall covered with photos of employees, customer letters, and what appeared to be family pictures from company events. "Welcome to Skyline Airlines," Eleanor said, gesturing for David to take a seat in a comfortable chair near her desk. "Before we go any further, I want you to know that everything that's happened today has been genuine. I really was struggling at the airport this morning, and you really did miss your flight to help me, but I also want you to understand why this matters so much." Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at the city below. 6 months ago, I decided it was time to expand our customer experience division. We've grown from a small regional carrier to a significant player in the industry, but I never want us to lose the personal touch that made us successful. I've been looking for someone to head this new division, someone who understands that customer service isn't about following scripts, it's about caring for people. David listened in amazement as Eleanor continued. "I've interviewed dozens of candidates, people with impressive resumes, advanced degrees, years of experience at major carriers, but none of them could convince me that they truly understood what we're trying to achieve here. They talked about metrics and efficiency, but they didn't talk about people." Eleanor turned back to face David. "This morning, when I was genuinely struggling and feeling overwhelmed, you didn't hesitate to help. You sacrificed something important to you, that interview you needed so badly, to make sure a stranger was okay. That told me more about your character than any resume ever could. But Mrs. Whitman, Eleanor, I don't have the kind of qualifications you're probably looking for. I was just a middle manager at a much smaller operation." Eleanor shook her head. "David, you have something much more valuable than credentials. You have integrity, compassion, and real understanding of what customer service means. Those things can't be taught. Everything else can be learned." She moved to her desk and picked up a folder. "I had my team do some quick research on you during our flight. Your former colleagues had nothing but praise for your work. The passenger satisfaction scores for your areas of responsibility were consistently the highest in the company. And when I called your former boss to ask about you, he admitted that letting you go was one of the biggest mistakes the company made during their restructuring." David's eyes widened. "You called my former boss?" "I did. And he said something very interesting. He said that you were the kind of manager who made everyone around you better, and that losing you was like losing the heart of their operation." Eleanor opened the folder and pulled out what appeared to be a job description. "David, I'd like to offer you the position of Director of Customer Experience for Skyline Airlines. You'd be responsible for developing and implementing customer service strategies across all our operations, training our staff and making sure that every passenger who flies with us feels valued and cared for." David felt like he might faint. "I don't know what to say." "The salary is significantly more than what you were making before," Eleanor continued. "We provide excellent health insurance, profit sharing, and a comprehensive relocation package if you decide to move your family to Denver. But more importantly, you'd be working for a company that shares your values about treating people well." David thought about Lisa and Tommy back home, about the bills on their kitchen table, about the months of rejection and worry. But mostly, he thought about the opportunity to work for someone who seemed to genuinely care about doing business the right way. "There's one condition," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "What's that?" "You have to promise me that you'll never lose that instinct to help people, even when it might not be convenient or profitable. That's the heart of what makes great customer service, and it's what I saw in you today." David stood up and extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitman, I would be honored to work for Skyline Airlines." Eleanor shook his hand warmly. "Welcome to the team, David. I have a feeling this is the beginning of something wonderful." As David called Lisa with the incredible news, he couldn't help but marvel at how a simple act of kindness had changed everything. Sometimes he realized missing one flight really does lead to catching the right one. 6 months later, David's customer service innovations had been featured in 3 industry publications, and Skyline Airlines had won 2 awards for passenger satisfaction. But the thing David was most proud of was the thank you letter from a passenger whose elderly mother had received exceptional care during a difficult flight. care that was provided by staff who had been trained to see every passenger as someone's family member deserving of kindness and respect. Eleanor had been right. Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as moments when we choose to help others without expecting anything in return.